Okay, so let's pick up with the next video on our Federalism flashcards. So these next two flashcards, number 13 and 14, very, very important. As you know, over the course of the year, we're going to be studying key Supreme Court cases. We're going to talk about a lot of them, but some of them are actually required cases that we have to know and understand just based on knowing the name of it. And so it's really important we know the case McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. versus Lopez because they're on that list. McCulloch versus Maryland, you watched a video on this. It's basically about whether a state, in this case Maryland, can tax an entity of the national government. In this case, it would be the national bank. And then furthermore, the question is, can the national government create a national bank in the first place? Is that something that the national government has the power to do? Because it's not explicitly enumerated in Article 1, Section 8. So the state of Maryland tries to tax a national bank, and the Supreme Court basically says you can't do this. And there are three clauses in the Constitution. For each of the cases we're going to be talking about, we need to know what are the constitutional clauses involved and how does it connect to what we've been studying. In this case, there are basically three clauses. One is the Supremacy Clause. So there's a question about, is the national government supreme to the states? And in here they say they're acting under their constitutional authority, and they are supreme. And then you have the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. So the Commerce Clause says that the states can regulate the federal government can regulate commerce. And the Necessary and Proper Clause says that you can pass any law that helps you do this. And so, therefore, creating a national bank is justified under the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's an implied power. It does a lot to dramatically expand how that phrase can be interpreted and what the power of the national government is. And we, of course, talked about in class how the Commerce Clause is used over and over again throughout U.S. history to expand governmental power. But with flashcard 14, in the case of U.S. versus Lopez, there's actually kind of this line drawn by the court in the 1990s when the federal government passes the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which says you can't have a weapon in a school zone. This is justified under the Commerce Clause, and the Supreme Court strikes down this law. So the Commerce Clause, which is the constitutional clause involved, they say is not applicable in this issue. This is not about commercial activity, regulating guns in school zones. And so the federal government just doesn't have that authority. So the idea that the Commerce Clause does have limits is established in the 1990s, and it's certainly very much debated today. But U.S. versus Lopez is one of those cases which really illustrates that, although these precedents are set in cases like McCulloch versus Maryland and many other Commerce Clause cases, there can be an evolution in how the clause is interpreted, and there can be limits on these sorts of powers. Starting on flashcard 15, we'll talk about the kind of over time federalism shifting concept. So dual federalism is what we have in the kind of mid-1800s. First we start with the Marshall Court and the kind of the birth of the country and this expansion of federal power. These Supreme Court cases that establish that, like McCulloch versus Maryland. But in the mid-1800s, you have this kind of era of dual federalism. State and federal governments are going to do separate things. They're going to have their own separate spheres and clearly defined roles, and they're not going to blend together. And so we call this layer cake federalism. The idea that you have different layers in a cake. You have the state government does some things, federal government does other things. They don't do the same things necessarily. They don't mix their powers and their roles in society. But that changes. It really does change a lot in the 20th century, specifically during the New Deal era, during the Great Depression, when the federal government starts to say, we're going to start doing things that maybe states traditionally do. We're going to start adding more regulations. We're going to start creating all sorts of new programs, working with infrastructure projects, for example, paying to build roads and bridges and hire artists, all these things that maybe people thought, that's kind of a state role. Well, now the federal government's going to be cooperating with them in that regard. They're going to be providing funding. They're going to be starting programs, but they're still going to rely on state governments to identify where these projects need to work, where they need to be implemented. So this idea of marble cake federalism, which goes right along with cooperative federalism, the idea that there's a blend and there's a mix in what state and federal government is doing. And in cooperative federalism, there's clearly this established dominance of the federal government. They're the ones kind of driving the show. And the states are kind of working underneath them, and there is a blend in who is in charge of what and who's doing what. In the 70s and 80s, you kind of have a pushback against that in this era of new federalism. an era where, particularly Richard Nixon and later on Ronald Reagan, they're going to say, let's give power back to the states. New Deal, and then later on in the 1960s, continued expansion of the federal government. They're going to say it's gone too far, and the federal government is doing too much. We want to deregulate things. If we're going to do grants, we want them to be in block grant form instead of in categorical grant form. We want the states to have autonomy and power over the decisions they make, over where they spend their money. And the idea of the devolution revolution goes right along with new federalism. And, we talked about this in class in the context of Supreme Court decisions, in which conservative justices are going to make decisions like U.S. versus Lopez or other decisions that we talked. We did a whole study of a series of them in class that say, if there's a question of whether states can do something versus whether the federal government can do something, more often the court's going to start to say the states have authority here. They're going to look to the 10th Amendment or other clauses of the Constitution to say the states have power, or that the federal Constitution doesn't give the Congress power to do certain things. So power is going to be devolving. Right? It evolved back. It evolved earlier to give the federal government power. Now it's going to devolve that power back to the states. And so the last two slides, flashcards, are just kind of broad concepts. 21 says, how does federalism create multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy? So just broadly speaking, this is kind of just a philosophical discussion about our system. And, just like in our previous unit, we talked about three branches of government and how people can have access points. They can try to influence Congress. They certainly can vote in the presidency. They can take cases to the Supreme Court. So too, under a federal system, if there's an issue that you want to be the government to get involved in or help resolve, there's different ways to approach it. You can try to lobby or get involved at the federal level and try to influence policy there, or at the state level. We can see that right now in 2020 with COVID-19 response. The state government is doing a lot of things. But sometimes they say, well, maybe the federal government would be more equipped to do it in a different way. And there's different ways to approach it. And people who want to bring about resolutions to issues, they can approach both angles. They have multiple access points, right? So that's important as a part of, how policy is constructed and how people can influence it. And then also the final flashcard is another broad philosophical conversation we've been having throughout the unit. How is national policy constrained by the sharing of power between the three branches and state governments? Congress can't just come along and say, this is what we're going to do. And, that's the end of the conversation. First of all, there's checks and balances within it. And then there's also a question is, does the federal government have the authority to do it overall? And so if we're going to get back to our last unit and the first few flashcards in our last unit, talking about limited government, this is part of the limitations on the system. The idea that the power is shared between state and national government. It's not, it's a federal system. It's not a unitary system. It's not a confederation. So if the power is shared, then it is limited by that sharing. And that is part of our limited government system, is the fact that we have these different access points that we talked about in the previous flashcard. So hopefully this video was helpful to you, and I will emphasize again, as I emphasized at the beginning of these videos, they are starting points. They are overviews. Some of these things, maybe I'm just touching on a little bit now. Haven't fully talked about them in class, but an awful lot of them we explored in more depth in class in some of our lessons or in your textbook reading or some visuals that were provided. So you want to make sure you're going through all the resources we did in class throughout the unit to study, and then using this as kind of a focal point to make sure we can build off of what we've done in these videos. So thanks a lot, and have a great day.